Before I get started, I am recording my session. If that matters to anybody, I at least wanted to let everybody know that I will be recording it for my own use. But before I even get into the talk, I want to say thanks to all the sponsors that made that conference possible. I don't know about y'all, but I have been having a blast here at both this and the one in Texas. And on that note, next year, July 29th through August 1st, will be the next that conference in Wisconsin. So sign up. I hope to be there. Hope to see you there. So my talk is titled Demystifying Deployment as a Service. The whole point of this is to take the modern hosting web platforms we've come to know and love, like Netlify and Vercel, specifically Netlify for this talk because it's what I'm more comfortable with, and breaking down how the deployment process works and giving you some kind of a groundwork framework in which you can kind of build some of this kind of stuff yourself. As far as an agenda goes, we are going to start by exploring how Netlify works. Has everyone worked with Netlify or deployed something in Netlify? A couple people? Okay. Well, we'll step through it just so we know how it works. We'll then deconstruct the process and kind of go through how Netlify deploys their tool, deploys to their site, and then I will give you some ideas of tools that you can use on your own, at least as far as categories go. I have a small demo where I will show off an application that I built and deployed directly to AWS in a very similar manner as Netlify without actually having to touch any of the deployment stuff myself. I will show you, give you some more tips and tricks on how you can get started doing some of this stuff on your own. And then finally, we'll wrap up. And if there are any questions, we can address them at the end, or if I go long, we'll be in the hallway. So that's how that goes. So my name is Brian Morrison. I am this is what AI thinks I should look like, so I really like this picture and I've decided to use it everywhere. I am a full stack developer. I write a lot with Go, I write a lot with React, and there we go. And I build a lot of things on AWS. That's just kind of my preferred stack. I like to branch out and learn new things though, so I'm always kind of changing this up. I'm 60-40, I lean more towards the back end, so that's back-end development is really where I get the most enjoyment out of. By day, I'm a developer educator at a company called PlanetScale, which is a managed MySQL platform for serverless applications. I do a lot of content for them, so I create videos for the blog, or videos for the YouTube channel. I write for the blog, and I manage the documentation there. Before that, I was actually a lead backend developer for an IoT company, so I worked a lot on the integration side of things. I basically would be told, we need to get this new device integrated into our systems, and I was given a manual where I'd have to kind of decipher the data that was coming in and figure out how to transform it into a common object model that we worked with. And then before that even, I was in systems, so I used to do a lot of racking and stacking of servers and managing of data centers. I did a lot of networking stuff, so the back end is really kind of where I love to live. Outside of tech, I have an amazing wife and 3 boys. They're all running around the water park right now. As some of you heard before we kicked this off, I recently moved out to Kentucky where we're trying to start a small farm and be a little self-sufficient. So there's a chicken and a dog for scale of one of ours that we currently have now. And then outside of even that, when I'm not hanging out with my family, I'm also a gamer. I like playing the game Destiny and Destiny 2. I fell in love with it years ago. Maybe not a thing to bring up as a hobby, but it'll be important in just a little bit. So keep that in mind. I was on Stadia, actually. What? Yeah, it worked really well for me, but PlayStation now. For sure. So deploying to Netlify, for those of you who don't understand or have ever experienced the process of it, is kind of cool. You start by writing code. Doesn't really matter what you're deploying with or deploying to. Everyone has to start with writing something. You make your commits and you push them up to GitHub. And then Netlify kind of comes along and has this black box of magic where it takes your code and transforms it in some capacity, and then your website's live, and people can come in and use it. It's kind of cool stuff. I actually really enjoy it, regardless of whether I use it for whatever projects I'm working on. So again, the whole point of this talk is to kind of like explore how the magic works behind services like Netlify. If I had to sum this up into a single word, my preferred word of choice is DevOps. I had an alternate working version of this slide where I was going to throw automation in there. I kind of think of DevOps and automation as going kind of hand in hand, whereas DevOps is more like the philosophy and the procedures behind some of the automation and ways that we get our tools pushed out into, or the ways we get our applications pushed out into the public world. So this is kind of the whole cornerstone of what I'd like to talk about today. So looking inside the black box that is Netlify, if you ever deploy to Netlify and go into one of the deploy logs on their platform, they break it down into 5 distinct steps. There's initialize, build, deploy, cleanup, and post-processing. So we're going to briefly take a look at what happens during each one of these steps. The first step is initialization. And what basically happens here is a build container is set up to build and deploy your application. In a previous world, these used to be dedicated build servers, which would have your runtimes and your dependencies that you would need to build your application set up and configured so this way it can handle this process. Containers have made this much more streamlined and efficient, where you can just create a container that contains those runtimes and use that to build instead of a dedicated server. During this process in Netlify, it also installs your dependencies. So Netlify is very JavaScript focused. So this would be where something like npm run install comes into play, and everything is downloaded into your node modules folder. Actually, forewarning, before we go any further, I have never actually worked for Netlify. A lot of this is just inference for my years of using it, as well as my years of creating these kinds of pipelines myself. So I'm not giving any away trade secrets. The next step is to build the site. So this would be where your npm run build comes into play, and then your website is compiled or transpiled, whatever word you want to use, into a set of artifacts. And these artifacts are these packages that are deployed out into the public space. If it's something like a website, this would be where your HTML, your CSS, and JavaScript is deployed out into a public server where people can access it and load it in their browsers. If you're doing something like using the serverless functions that are available in Netlify, this is where those serverless functions are also built and deployed out into something like AWS Lambda. So this is the process where everything is constructed and getting ready to be deployed, which leads into the deploy phase, where those artifacts are then pushed to where they need to go. The serverless binaries, once they're built, are pushed to where they need to go. And then looking at the logs, we can also see that Netlify's global CDN, where those files are accessed from people all over the world to make it faster and efficient for users, those are replaced with the new versions of the artifacts, as well as the routing is updated, which can be useful in situations on Netlify where you need to roll back. The routing's pointed to the new versions of the code and functions, essentially. Cleanup on Netlify, if you're in the older world where you're using dedicated servers or running your own stuff, this would be like any kind of cruft that was generated during the build process, kind of cleaned up and wiped away. In Netlify's specific situation, it actually caches the older versions of the artifacts so you can quickly roll back to them if you ever need to. Your dependencies are also cached during this phase too, so this way if you make changes to your web application and push it back up into GitHub, Netlify does not have to grab all of those packages from npm and pull them back down. And then the final phase in Netlify is post-processing, where there is like Netlify-specific stuff. This isn't common across all pipelines, but if you notice in the logs on screen, this is from a website that I had built where I'm using Netlify Forms, which is a dedicated function of Netlify websites, where they will automatically detect forms on there and process them into a table that you can see and use that data for later. And this is where some of that stuff happens. So now we want to take a look at how to build our own black box. Extra points for Futurama fans if you understand that joke. So the first category of tool that I'd want to set forth is orchestration. I like to think of the orchestration tools as like the puppet master of the entire process. It's what pulls the strings. It's what executes any kind of scripts that need to be run in order to kind of set up things, create the artifacts, build them, deploy them out to where they need to go, and update any configuration of infrastructure that might need to be updated. The next thing is file storage and hosting. Your stuff has to live somewhere. Website, HTML, CSS, JavaScript has to live somewhere where browsers can access it, so that is extremely important. Content delivery network, although kind of optional, the whole concept of a content delivery network, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is like this global network of endpoints where these files will live, so they can be closer to the users. This means that if you have users inside the middle of the United States, and you have users that are in Europe, if those files will live in both places, so this way when the users try and access your website, it'll be nice and fast for them. Backend code execution, if you are writing any kind of API, you'll need a way to run that API. If you're writing serverless functions, you'll need a way to execute those serverless functions when the requests come in. Routing is important, so this way, as your functions are deployed out somewhere, wherever they go, whatever region you decide to deploy them to, and someone makes a request to them, the backend system, the overall system, knows where to forward those requests to. Authentication is important, obviously, if you want users for your website. I wanted to call this out specifically because I highly recommend to use a dedicated authentication platform like one of the sponsors, Auth0, that's right outside. Clerk.dev is another one that I'm pretty familiar with, but I like to encourage people to use kind of hardened, battle-tested authentication systems because, you know, as developers, we're not all necessarily security experts, and your average run-of-the-mill build your own JWT service is probably not the best thing to follow. And then finally, my personal favorite of this entire thing is infrastructure as code, or IAC for short. What IAC lets you do is define all of the resources in the cloud provider of your choice, which in my case is AWS, in one or more configuration files, and then you run a single command or a short list of commands in order to deploy the resources that you need to host your code wherever it needs to go. So we're going to take a look at this in just a moment. Now it's time for my brief demo. So this is my app that I built. I said Destiny was going to be important. This is where it becomes important. Before I can explain what my app does, it's worth giving a brief 2-second introduction to Destiny. So Destiny is a game that has tons of activities, and depending on the equipment you have on your character, the more harder activities can be made significantly harder or significantly easier. So a lot of content creators in the Destiny space will create videos or articles about like what equipment you want to put on your character to achieve certain things. And I have a tendency of watching these videos when I'm doing something like washing the dishes, which is one of my guilty pleasures because I don't have to use my brain when I'm doing it. So I'm washing dishes and I'm watching a video and I'm like, yes, as soon as this is done, I'm going to forget everything that I just listened to. So wouldn't it be nice if these content creators can create a link, drop it in the description of their video, and everything is just laid out there for me, and that is where GuardianForge was born. So as a brief demo of the app now, I'm logged in here. I can log in, or I can select one of my characters in the game. I like my Titan personally, and this essentially lists out all the equipment I have on my character. If I click on Create Build, it will present me with a new form. Zoom in here a little bit just to move the fields up, where it shows, again, all the equipment I have on here, but it gives me a couple of other options here. I can give my build a name. I can add some notes here on how specifically to use the build, because depending on what's equipped, it could change the way the player should use it. And I can select the activity of where the build it might be, you know, useful for. Again, one of those endgame activities. Now, if you notice in here, there are two icons that are similar between Crucible and competitive. These are my player versus player activities. These are like where I thrive, because I like fighting against real people all around the world, right? And let's say I want to come in here and add a secondary activity because, you know, a single build can be used across multiple activities, right? So let's go ahead and explore how I've done that with a combination of AWS services, AWS SAM, which is my IAC tool of choice, and GitHub Actions. So I've got a pull request already staged. I am not confident enough to do live coding up here yet, so we've got the pull request staged. If I go through here, I have added a secondary activity field to my Go model, which controls the data that goes into AWS and is stored for later. As far as the front-end code, I have a secondary activity on my prop, and if I scroll down here, there's a secondary activity icon that is displayed on the build once it's done. There's a form field that's in here using custom components. I have a lot of nested components, so a lot of this is just prop drilling that goes down and lets me basically select that secondary activity. So I can come in here and, you know, review the code. I like everything that looks good, right? So I'm going to go ahead and merge this pull request. And once I merge this pull request, what's going to happen is a series of GitHub actions are going to kick off based on this thing that I just did, this merging of a pull request. And if I go over to actions, which I already have, we just select the tab here. There are two actions that I have defined, two workflows, deploy app and deploy backend. I like to work in monorepos. I like to keep all common concepts together for a specific application. I can because I'm the only one that works on this, but I understand why sometimes that doesn't fit in certain organizations. But looking at one of these, like let's select the front end first, deploying the app. So if I drill down in here, these are the steps that are all defined in my GitHub action workflow file in order to set up, in order to build and then deploy a new version of my front end out into AWS. Stepping through each one of these, setup job is very similar to Netlify's initialization process, where we're setting up a container that's going to run in order to perform all the steps that we want to do. Checkout here will clone a version of the code down into that container. I have a shared library that is used across 3 separate front-end applications, which we could talk about afterwards if you're interested in that, and my craziness why I decided to do that. Transform configurations. Now, this is something that happens that's not really displayed inside of the Netlify process. Netlify supports the concept of a build and environment per branch. I don't necessarily have the same thing set up for GuardianForge, but I do have 2 environments, a QA environment and a production environment. By transforming configurations, it's basically a JSON file that I'm swapping out configuration values using GitHub action secrets. And this is where I can set up my different builds for different environments that I want to deploy them to. And this is getting a little bit ahead of me. Hold on. Scroll back up here. So npm install build, that's like your build process. Clean the deploy directory wipes out the existing files that are pushed out to AWS and prepares everything for the new version of the front end. Copy to S3, copies the new front end, and then invalidate cache is a different method of basically telling CloudFront, which is my service in AWS that I use for CDN, that you can get rid of the old files because they're not useful anymore. When a user makes a request for the new version of the front end, return the new files and then cache those instead. A little different from what Netlify does, but essentially it accomplishes the same thing. So now if I go, sure, go ahead. Yes. Downside, no, that's the downside of doing what I'm doing. So luckily, my website, my Destiny Gamer website is not production critical, so I can get away with some things like this. Yes, so now if you look at the backend process, same thing, set up the container, checking out the code. I'm setting up AWS SAM, which is the runtime that I need available in order to execute the IAC tool, the infrastructure as code tool, to deploy all my resources out to AWS or to update them if they need to be updated. I have a default params.json file, which is used to transform the configs, but essentially this is just kind of like staging the application in order to be deployed to the environment it needs to go. Transform configurations is the same as the front end, and then build and deploy. This is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting parts of this entire process because it calls a single command which will reference a giant configuration file that I'll show in a moment, set up everything in AWS, and then deploy everything out. So looking at how these actions are defined, we'll start with the front end again. There's a name that is given to my workflow, and this is the same thing that is displayed in GitHub's UI. The on section of this GitHub action, actually zoom in here a little bit just to make it a little bigger. So the on section is actually my triggers. Now, when I had mentioned earlier that by merging a deploy request, I automatically kick these things off, this is the section of the GitHub action workflow template that actually does that. Workflow dispatch lets me deploy manually, but this section down here is what kind of controls that magical interaction between the pull requests and then the deployment process. Essentially here what I'm saying is anytime there's a push done to my QA branch and there's a change to the files within frontend/public/whatever afterwards, kick this whole thing off. Here's where I'm setting up my AWS environment. There is a lot of CLI and scripting that happens inside of here. So using the AWS CLI, these are essentially the 3 things that you need in order to authenticate into AWS. The runs on section of my deploy job is actually that container. So GitHub Actions, you can swap in and out the type of container that you want to use in order to deploy your application. So if you need a Windows runtime, you can use a Windows runtime. Let's see, stepping down, here's the checkout where things are cloned down. You'll notice that my shared library is built using a bash script that is defined right here using npm CI and npm run build inside of a working directory. And a lot of this is going to be more of the same. So I have a custom Go script that I had written in order to transform configurations, but everything almost all the way down is just running bash scripts. All the way down to running the AWS CLI in order to clean the deploy directory, copy the new artifacts out to S3, and then invalidate my cache. Flipping over to the back-end process, a lot of it is very much the same. I have very similar triggers, however, this is on the back end. So if I, for whatever reason, since I like working with a monorepo, if I change files for just the front end, there's no reason to deploy the back end out again. So it speeds up the process. I only need to redeploy the front end, and that's how I kind of can control it. That's why the paths are a little bit different here. We're setting up the AWS environment again, setting up SAM. This is an action step template, which we will come back to in just a moment, well, a little bit later. I'm doing the same thing where I'm transforming configuration files, and then finally, I'm calling the SAM CLI using make deploy QA, which basically just passes the configuration into SAM deploy, which again, this is the only thing I need to run in order to trigger the deploy process. And then the last thing I want to show as part of this demo, at least diving into the code, is my template.yaml file, which is actually the definition for all of the resources in AWS that I have defined. I literally could probably talk for 2 hours if we step through each one of these, but I'm calling out a couple of specific sections. You'll notice that in here, there is a parameters section, which you can use to pass in those configuration values into AWS SAM. And there's all sorts of parameters that I have defined in here. I have certain things that are specific to AWS, like, for instance, my site domain name, which is used to specify the domain name for accessing GuardianForge, including the API domain name. But also scrolling down, I have things like an OAuth client ID and secret, which is used to log in using my Bungie account. I have some Discord information because I like getting Discord notifications when things occur, so on and so forth. Scrolling down into resources, you'll notice that just calling out this one section here, this data bucket. So this is where some of the data for GuardianForge actually lives. Instead of going into AWS and clicking around to configure an S3 bucket to store data, as well as configure that bucket, I have everything inside of this one chunk of YAML that defines all of the configuration parameters that are necessary for GuardianForge to run. And a lot of this 800 plus 801 line file is more of the same thing. It is essentially a giant configuration, not only of the resources that I need in AWS to power this whole thing, but also the individual configuration parameters for each one of those resources. And this was a lot of trial and error, just making this all come together and work. Yes, sir?
The difference between SAM and CloudFormation. I've used CloudFormation, not SAM.
So SAM uses CloudFormation on the back end. But the reason I like SAM is I can actually run it locally on my machine. So I can call SAM run, I think it is. Again, I have it buried in a make file, so I don't remember the command off the top of my head. But it'll fire up a API gateway plus server plus Lambda functions-esque environment for me just to quickly test things locally on my machine. So, but essentially, it uses CloudFormation as the backend service. So now, it doesn't do CDK, not to my knowledge. So carrying on, we noticed that everything has completed. We got green checks across the board. If I go back into GuardianForge and I refresh this, provided the demo gods are with me, we should have a secondary activity drop down there for me to select, which we do. So the whole call out here is I wanted to show that I was able to make a change just to the code, merge a pull request into the branch, and then the whole process took care of everything for me. I didn't actually have to log on and manually deploy anything, which is very similar to the way that deploying code out to Netlify works. Okay, back to slides. So here is the infrastructure that I use for GuardianForge in a nutshell. For my orchestration layer, I'm using GitHub Actions. I actually recently ported this over from API or Azure DevOps, which I was using before. Turns out when you put inside of a talk description that you're going to use certain tools, you actually have to use those tools, so I had to rewrite this. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by how quickly the deployment process actually works. File storage and hosting, again, is all done with AWS S3. It's just for unstructured storage inside of AWS, of which things like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript realistically are. So that's how I'm serving up those. My CDN is CloudFront, which again is that globally distributed network of endpoints where my files are sent to. So this way my users all across the world can access them. And I have seen users from across the world access my application, which I'm actually proud of. Backend code is all AWS Lambda. I have 20 to 30 Lambda functions, which is way more than it really needs to. When I was building this, I went down a hardcore path of let's learn all the best practices about Lambda and deploying things serverless in AWS. I came across a video of somebody saying you should have a Lambda function for every single operation you want to perform inside of AWS. I took that very literally. So I have a Lambda function for not only every single API endpoint, but every single action of every single API endpoint, which I do not recommend doing personally because you create a management nightmare for yourself. Routing is a combination actually of CloudFront and API Gateway. So as mentioned earlier, I have 3 separate front-end applications. I have one for the application, which we just saw, and then I have a separate Gatsby application that is for my documentation portal, and then one for the blog. So I have 3. By using some configurations inside of CloudFront, I can actually map based on the path that's coming in to different subdirectories or keys, as they call them, in AWS S3. So if something comes in with no subdirectory, or something comes in with /docs, it forwards it to docs, /blog goes to blog, and if it's nothing else, it defaults to /app, which is where the files in S3 live for the app. API Gateway is used for routing of the whole backend system. So I actually have a separate domain for GuardianForge for the backend, api.guardianforge.com, as one would guess. And that terminates to API Gateway, where depending on the API route and the request, the action coming in, it will route to the correct Lambda function behind the scenes. Authentication is all done with Bungie's actually their own OAuth system. I figured for an application like GuardianForge, if you're going to use it, you're going to be playing Destiny, so there's no reason I really need to home roll my own authentication or even use something that the other providers have. Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. IAC, or infrastructure as code, that's AWS SAM. We saw that and talked quite in depth about that. You'll notice for GuardianForge, I also have a couple of other things on here that I didn't mention earlier. Search actually uses Algolia, which a lot of people I think are familiar with, especially in the front-end development world. It's a really excellent indexing and search platform that's completely separate from anything like AWS. But there's also that other icon up there, that yellow one. That is an icon for SQS, which is a queuing system. For those of you who are not familiar with queuing, it's a fairly simple concept. I mean, it can be as deep as you want it to be, but a 10,000-foot view is you have one application or provider that drops a message onto a queue. Then you have another application that picks it up and does whatever it wants with it. That's queuing in a nutshell. When you create a build in GuardianForge, there are actually 5 things that happen. So the first thing is there's a giant JSON payload that's sent to the API, which gets saved into S3. It doesn't get saved in a database because when somebody enters the actual ID of a build, it fetches that JSON file as opposed to performing lookups in a database, which is actually saves me time and money on the front end. However, for the interface where you might want to see a list of builds, there's also an index record that's stored inside of DynamoDB. So that's 2. I have a custom function that creates a nice open graph image because I want the sharing ability of GuardianForge to be as polished as possible. So if somebody comes along and posts a link on Twitter, they get a nice preview of the gear that's going to be inside of that build. We also forward a message to Algolia for indexing. So this way, whenever somebody uses search on my website or on GuardianForge, they'll be able to see it. And then 5, every time GuardianForge is used, I send myself a Discord message because I like that little dopamine hit that people are actually using my application. So 5 things. Now, even though there are 5 things that happen, only the first 2 are really required for the app to function properly. So if I was using something like Netlify and their serverless functions, which I do love, but if I was using it, I would essentially have to roll all these things into a single serverless function. They have a maximum amount of CPU power, maximum amount of memory that you can assign to them, and they cap at 10 seconds unless you want to pay and then call them and ask them, can you pretty please make it more than 10 seconds? So instead of doing that route, what I instead chose to do is asynchronously process the 3 operations that don't need to occur using SQS and a Lambda function, which expands my ability to do more things later on, but also creates a better user experience for my users because they're not waiting as long for those operations to complete. And then for completion, I just threw on there, I use a combination of Lambda and Stripe for payments. Okay, real question is, why the hell would any of you want to do all this? When I submitted the CFP for this, there was an ask in there to provide a reason why somebody would want to come and view this talk. And there were 2 things in there, but I've actually come away with 4 now after putting this all together, which I'd like to present to you. The first one is more skills is more opportunities. The more things you know how to work with, the more opportunities you have in the workforce. And we are no strangers to the fact that the whole tech workforce is kind of in a dire state right now. People are getting let go left and right. And the harsh reality is if you're in a batch of people of 10,000 that are let go and you all have similar jobs and similar titles, you are now competing with 9,999 other people in the workforce to put food on the table. So if you are like 95% level, you know, see people resumes, they have 95% React, and you have somebody that's like 80% but also knows a lot of this stuff, chances are the person who knows more is going to be more valuable to a company, which means you have more opportunities to actually re-enter the workforce. There are more services you can use. I demonstrated using SQS plus another Lambda function, I can improve user experience, which is something that's not available to me in Netlify. So it gives you more opportunity to use different things, which may or may not help at the end of the day for what you're trying to build. The next thing is I'm a firm believer of having fundamental knowledge. I think when we all start learning things, it's good to start at the surface level, start easy, but it's also worthwhile going deep into that specific topic. Story I have about fundamental knowledge, and this actually is completely aside from code. So many years ago, before I even decided to become a software developer, I wanted to go down the networking path. I was studying for all my Cisco certs. I wanted to work in that whole world, which I don't want to anymore, thankfully. But when I was working as a systems engineer, I worked for a logistics company, managed 2 big data centers and 20 to 30 smaller warehouses in the network for everything. Get a call one morning from the secondary data center, which is also our second largest warehouse, and says, hey, everything's down, can't go back online. Interesting. We contract with AT&T to make sure that doesn't happen. We call AT&T and they're like, oh yeah, one of our hubs somewhere in the pipeline is offline. Now we had failover internet there, but the problem was the way that it was configured by AT&T, because they like to control their stuff, is it was only looking 1 or 2 hops up that network to make sure that things are still online. And this was farther up the chain. So to them, everything seemed like it was online. So they were like, and again, if you've ever worked with a company like AT&T, they work at AT&T's pace. We had no ETA on when things were going to come back online. So we were kind of up a creek, if you will. Now, since I had been studying fundamentals of routing protocols, I understood conceptually, hey, if I call John at that warehouse and say, hey, go to the network cable, go to the network closet, unplug this cable and move it over here, theoretically, it should cause things to heal, which it did. It decided to use our backup internet there. And everyone's like, yay, internet's back. We could work again. No, they weren't. A lot of people probably weren't. But I kind of got to be a little bit of the hero of that story, which is cool. It's nice. But the more fundamental knowledge you have on things, the more it's going to help you in the workforce. The more you can notice when things are going wrong, you can debug things and be the hero of your story too. And then finally, if you've sat through the last 32 minutes of me talking about all this stuff and you're like, yeah, this is cool and all, but I don't want to have any part of it, that's okay too. Like, yeah, I showed you a complex application that I built on AWS, but my website's still on Netlify. There's no reason not to use Netlify for something like that. I don't need the complexity that comes along with that. And if anything, you have a greater appreciation for everything that services like Netlify have done for us over the years and to make these deployments a lot easier. I mean, I remember back when I first started studying all this stuff, the way to deploy stuff was like Tejas said if you were here yesterday, is FTP to a server and hope for the best. So things have gotten a lot better over the years. And if you're on the other side of the conversation and you're like, yeah, this is cool, I want to learn more about this, I want to figure out how to get started and do more with it. The first tip I have for you is start small and grow. If you have a site on Netlify, you could start very simply by figuring out how to use the Netlify CLI plus GitHub Actions to deploy your site to Netlify instead of using their automated system. I think that is a perfect first step for those of you who are using it currently. That's actually what I do for my website because, again, being able to do this opens up opportunities. I have a post-processing function for my website that does some analytics-y stuff. And I'm not good with analytics, but at least there's some stuff there for me to work with if I ever need to. My next tip is to master your ecosystem. You got to know how your own kind of world bubble works. So if you work in JavaScript, know how to build stuff, know how to deploy stuff manually. I think it really goes a long way for learning how to do this stuff. I work a lot with Go, so that's another world, completely different from JavaScript, but same thing, different ecosystem. I'm looking to explore Laravel next, which is the next big thing I think I kind of want to tackle, and I know nothing about Laravel, but the first thing that I'm going to do before I deploy anything, figure out how to build stuff, figure out how to package the artifacts, figure out how to deploy things, what services do I need to run, to run a Laravel application. And then after that, learn how to automate things. So most of you didn't catch, everything in my pipeline was more or less bash scripts. That's the way that I like to work. If you're familiar with GitHub Actions, they do provide a wonderful marketplace full of templates that you can use for steps inside your deployment jobs. It's cool and all, but the problem is I can't run step templates on my local machine. I can run bash on my local machine. I can run PowerShell. And then I also recommend get good with CLIs, command line applications. Those are really helpful in situations like this. APIs are also great as well. So if you need to connect into another service, I mean, as the one gentleman said, we're using CloudFormation behind the scenes. You really could write CLIs all day long if you really want to learn how to do this yourself. I don't even want to go down that level of agony, so I won't recommend it. I pressed the wrong button. Hold on. Here we go. All right, final couple takeaways. If at first you don't succeed, thank you. So our moms all told us this, I'm sure, when we were little. You fail on something, you try again. Well, DevOps kind of takes this a step further when it comes to building pipelines, and it kind of makes you try again and again and again. You're not going to master a pipeline the first time you do something. You're not going to master it the second time. You might not master it the 200th time, and that's kind of okay. Building pipelines is a very trial and error driven process. Like even when I was rebuilding my pipelines to use GitHub Actions over Azure DevOps, I had everything kind of laid out for me and knew all the steps I needed to take in order to make this happen. But the environment's a little bit different, the runtime's a little bit different, so it's a lot of, kick it off, it fails, find out what fails, try again. Fix it, try again. Fix it, try again. Over and over again. It took me about 2 to 3 hours in order to actually get it all nailed down and working in GitHub Actions. So don't lose heart if you don't get it the first time. These things take a while to actually master. Pirates of the Caribbean fans, anybody? What does Captain Barbossa say about the pirate code? Oh, I thought I had that one.
We don't talk about Fight Club?
Wrong Barbossa. The pirate code, like DevOps, I guess DevOps like the pirate code, is more of a set of guidelines, okay? There's no real one way to do that. I recently for a work thing, had to dive real hard into like DevOps literature and all the books and figure out all the steps and process. And if you go down this path, you will find out there are 8 phases of DevOps, and step 1 is A, and step 2 is B, and you follow all these procedures. I've worked in several organizations in my career with these processes all in place, and not one of them followed the DevOps standard that they set forth. What I like to tell people when they're learning to do this stuff is building pipelines should accomplish 3 things. You should be able to deploy your code consistently, efficiently, and safely from, say, Ann's computer out onto the public world for your users to use. Having all the 8 steps nailed down, which off the top of my head I can't even remember what they all are, is great and all, and probably looks good for like certifications if you're trying to get certifications for your company or accreditations, whatever they're called. But it's not realistic, especially not to start. So the challenge is, if you want to go down this, obviously try and build something yourself. Start small, grow. I work in developer marketing. What I've learned about developer marketing is we like logos. So there's a lot of logos on that screen. I don't expect everybody to know what all of them are, but what I have is that QR code up there, which you can scan with your phone, that will lead to a page on my website that breaks down several tools using a lot of the categories that I've described here today. I am recording the session, as I mentioned earlier. Once this is all done, I will have that there as well, along with my slides. But there's also the URL for those of you who are averse to scanning QR codes, which we have been asked to do a lot this conference. So, there's one more. That went a lot faster than I thought it was going to. So, breathtaking. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know, this is actually my first public talk that I'm giving in person. So, thanks, y'all. Oh, yeah. And, use that QR code to rate me if you actually enjoyed this talk. So Clark will keep having me come back to these things because I love coming. I don't know if you're smashing, liking, or doing anything with the QR, but yeah, I'd appreciate it. What did you build that at? The front end is 3 separate React apps. So again, it's basically React is the front end. The back end is all serverless functions written in Go. So like straight React, not like No, for those of you who don't know me, I am a big proponent of keeping separated. I don't like mushing things together, front end and back end. So I've never really gotten on board with the whole next, nuxt, whatever X you all want to use.
Yeah, I was just curious because I don't how that would work. I mean, one of the auto magical things Netlify does is next, which has the API for connect, takes those and those functions and the stuff like
Yeah.
code. So like, you can do similar to what you did, like function folders, and those are just files that are deployed like as is, but it's integrated into the full stack framework.
Right. Yeah, so I just, if we want to dive into the code real quick for the back end, I have this stack folder inside here. By the way, this is all open source, so if anyone wants to go Google GuardianForge on GitHub, I make all this available. These are all different subfolders that have like a bunch of different Lambda functions inside of them. Again, I was a masochist and I created a Lambda function for every single operation per endpoint. So yeah, and the nice thing is with the template folder, let's reset this. How do I do this again? There we go. Scrolling down and looking at one of the definitions for these Lambda functions, like this one right here. So all I have to do is basically map it to the folder where it lives. And this is one of the things I like about AWS SAM is based on this configuration file, it will build the code into whatever compiled version of Lambda whatever compiled version of the function that Lambda needs to run it and then deploy it out to AWS. So I see the value in things like Next and Nuxt, but I have a hard time wrapping my mind around them, to be entirely honest. Like for simple use cases like building an API, like I think that's pretty straightforward. But the more I don't know, the more complexity. Trying to use dependencies is something that's bit me so many times with Next, where it's like it doesn't support it in certain scenarios. So I've kind of more or less stayed away. Yes.
Is there anything with like dynamic domain names? Like, for example, if you have like a branch of your code that you want to deploy out to like not the production site, kind of like parallel site running like a different version of the app, like test something out, but getting it set up with like its own like domain name and stuff.
Theoretically, I could using a service in AWS called Route 53, I think is what it is. And that's where you can kind of like, you can use something like this to dynamically set like a subdomain for a URL. I haven't experimented with it and done it. That was one of the things that I originally wanted to set up, but 3 kids and a full-time job is a little hard to find time to play around with side apps these days. So that was why I put so much effort into the configuration transforms that I have there. The idea is I could do something with GitHub Actions. You can actually pull off like the name of the branch that's being merged in or committed to and do very similar things. So in theory, it's possible. I have not actually done it myself, though. Right. Yeah, I think I'm not. Yeah, I think the edge functions. Do they deploy their own infrastructure, or do they deploy to? Okay. Lifetime went sleep. Any other questions? Yes, James.
What did you use for your slides?
That has nothing to do with my talk.
I know, but they look so good.
That was Keynote.